Welcome to Landmark Talks Property, a podcast by Landmark Information Group that covers all things property in short and intelligent podcasts.
Welcome to Landmark Talks Property. Today we're picking up on a familiar question: can planning and sustainability truly work together? I think I reflect on that statement with an answer of course they can. The planning system is built around sustainable delivery of the balancing housing, environmental protection, economic growth, but in practice I guess things aren't always that straightforward. So what we're going to do today is explore whether that alignment starts to break down and why, not because we think the principles are wrong, but because we live in a system and a world where pressures and constraints and competing priorities come from everywhere. So I'm joined today by Chris Loaring, Managing Director of Landmark Legal and Argyle Environmental, and our Group Sustainability Director. Chris, thanks for being here today.
It's a pleasure, mate. Thank you for the invitation. It's a really good framing off the top. I mean, I think there's more conversation around how this all works in reality, because that's what we're more interested in from a commercial perspective. So yeah, it's not so much the theoretical basis for it, it's the practical reality of how these things interplay.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think whenever it comes to talking sustainability, there's always a natural deviation that every single person, and that your own internal bias of what you think that means. But Chris, could you give a sort of a context statement of what you think that means to you, and what that means in the wider context of our markets and I guess the planning system?
Really great start point, mate. I start every single one of my presentations with the same thing. It's really important to specify sustainability is such a broad term. You've got to be really clear. So for this topic of conversation, I would frame it very much that kind of relevant to planning, sustainability, it's about achieving balanced outcomes across three pillars, right? So those three pillars obviously are economic prosperity, social well-being and environmental protection. And it's that last one that's really, really key from a sustainability definition point of view. And the reason why I think you said, the reason why, if you ask 1,000 people, you'll get 1,000 different answers what sustainability means. The reason for that is because the environment, that third pillar, is changing, and it's changing now quicker than it ever has been, and that's unequivocal. So that adds a whole layer of complexity to it. It's not static. It needs to be continually updated and revised how we think about it.
Yeah, I completely appreciate that and understand. I think one of the first topics we wanted to move into is moving from the principles that we set out in the process and sort of the large-scale aims and objectives to the practical decisions that get made day to day throughout the industry and how that changes in practice. And I think when we look at planning policy framework, it's pretty clear. There's a framework embedded within it. It's a plan-led system, and sustainability is embedded. But as you say, we live in a world where that third pillar, the environmental pillar, is constantly changing. But yet we live in a world in which policies and procedure, let's be honest, can take some considerable time to catch up and adapt to those perspectives. And as a result, planning decisions are never made in the perfect outcome, in the perfect scenarios of what when they're written down on paper, and they're made under time pressure with incomplete information and priorities from a national and a local level often conflicting. So Chris, from your perspective, where do you see that starting to affect the sustainability outcomes? What's the practical outcome of that?
I think it's a good question. I mean, you've got two forces, haven't you? So you've got, if we've established that the environment itself is continually changing, right, and it's changing at a faster rate than ever before, that's complex, and you need to keep pace with that. You need to really drive analysis, understanding, output in that world. You've also then got opposite that the world of the reality, if you like, you want to frame it that way, like the regulation, the land viability, all of that stuff, and that's changing as well. Like we'll probably get into it at some point, but like the legislative framework is continually changing. So those two things collide all the time, and only with time, when you're trying to stitch multiple stakeholders together, do you get very efficient due diligence. Like it takes a bit of time for those two things to kind of sync together.
Yeah, agreed. And I think it's often in a world, and particularly in a market that we've got. Excuse me. We sit in a world where we have planning policies shaping, but also a reactive market to local and international forces as well, as we've seen through sort of housing development and the transactions that we see. What do you think the impact is when it comes down to the urgency of decision making for maybe planning, delivery, and housing targets versus the ambitions for sustainability that are set out at often a national level?
Yeah, it's kind of an area where I spend quite a lot of time. It's really interesting. I mean, I don't see them as opposite forces, really. I think we can get to a world where you can deliver really ambitious planning outcomes and also complete really holistic due diligence on covering all elements of sustainability. That we can get there, and I believe in that world. But I mean, yeah, put simply, the reality, as I said, until you work through and those kind of areas start to sync together, we live in a world where actually you're probably going to need to start to prioritise, and you're going to need to make practical decisions about, if you've got 10 things to consider, like what are the 8 material ones and what are the 2 you can drop off the end until things get more mature. Like that's the reality of where we are right now. I mean, just one practical example would be like, you know, sustainability 10 years ago or 15 years ago in planning might have been kind of tied pretty specifically to flood risk as a really core consideration. And you fast forward now 15 years later, and that's a pretty seamless, pretty slick process in terms of regulation process, like how these things are factored into development plans and all the rest of it. You compare that to biodiversity net gain, which is a relatively new thing, and start to try and unpick like the reality of how that's supported from a commercial perspective with products and services, and then factored into development plan. Like that's a less mature process. So yeah, there's a lot of variance across the multitude of factors within sustainability, but time is a really key thing to get some of these things less friction. Is less friction a word? I don't think less friction is a word, but yeah, you know what I mean.
Close enough. Yeah, I think there's some other practical examples we're seeing, particularly when we focus into the wonderful world of housing and that side of things is, I know probably a year, 18 months at this point from it, but the introduction of sort of the grey belt statements and positioning, I think that's a really clear articulation of the economic sort of sustainability aspect of there needs to be more available land, which is easier to I say easier, can be positioned to be easier to develop versus brownfield, while also continuing to protect the wider green belt. Excuse me. Example. I think that's a really neat example of the ambitions of the housing targets. The priority statements of wanting to protect green belt, but also taking a sensible decision in terms of, well, if these sites or these pieces of lands don't fully contribute to the sort of objectives of green belt, then let's redefine them and introduce a new sort of statement for bringing that in. And I think one of the other sort of scenarios is when we view sustainability through the full supply chain of either the transactional residential or commercial markets or any other markets like that. And I think it's how do we view sustainability as an equal consideration as part of that. So I guess, Chris, the question that I've got from there is, how does sustainability remain an equal consideration? And does it start to shift as it moves through the process, or are we seeing a more monumental shift in terms of how it's being positioned?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I think the way that I kind of, to go back to one of my aspirational statements about where I think we can get to, like I do believe in a world where, you know, you can cover off the multitude of factors needed from a sustainability point of view very efficiently, very quickly, very seamlessly within the planning system, and to the satisfaction of all stakeholders. That's a really long list of stuff. So you're talking about, like, just off the top of my head, flood risk assessments, biodiversity net gain, energy assessment, sustainable drainage, transport impact. Like the list goes on and on and on. But we are getting to a world where data is more accessible, more open, more interoperable, more available, and better quality, right? So I fully believe if we press fast forward, we're going to be in a world pretty soon where the key determining factors from a sustainability point of view, it's not a case of let's look at the 10 topics and drop 2 or 3 off to make sure that we can get the scheme through. It'll actually be, of those 10 topics, at a very early stage in this process, can I find out whether I've got a material risk in 2 of the 10, 8 of the 10, 3 of the 10, 5 of the 10? And we will get to that place. So if you look at, I know it's a different use case, but you look at conveyancing and the drive towards upfront information, fundamentally that's the right thing, right? So the more you know, the sooner, the more seamlessly a quite long and complex process can play out and be successful. It's the same with planning. Like that's the world that we will get to, and in that world it will no longer be a trade-off. It will be a more integrated, more kind of holistic and priority-based decision making, not at the expense of other things, but weighted considering everything. That's where I think we will get to, and we're not there right now. Like that's the cold reality. Like that's why it's difficult, and that's why there's so many different stakeholders involved in the process, and it takes a relatively long amount of time to get things done.
And I think that's bang on. And I think the example of conveyancing that you've brought, and I know this is an area you've worked in for a long time, and a significant effort working with your clients. I think one of the key things is also bringing that data and that information further up the sort of the process, but equally presenting it in a way that is consumable, being able to react to it and understand it. I appreciate this is slightly beyond what we've talked about already, but what has been your approach in terms of engaging with clients in the market about making something which is often either a completely new topic, a completely new expectation on an industry? How do you engage with people in terms of, well, this is the realities of what the market starts to look like, and work as in partnership to sort of make that information understandable and digestible?
Yeah, so I would say, I mean, the key thing first and foremost is that there's guidance, right? So you can't have any aggregate of industry players kind of doing a multitude of different things. Like, you need unified guidance that it's not a dictate, but it steers the ship, right? So it says you need to point in this, if you're going to tackle, for example, climate change and conveyancing, you need to point in this direction. The Law Society guidance stipulates you need to focus on these 4 topics, consider these things, and then play it through and make a decision about whether that's a material thing that you as a law firm want to cover in your guidance, and if you don't, then you need to specify that very clearly up front. So you need the rules of the game laid out. Once you've got that, you then need the commercial environment to make that kind of new area understandable. So you need really good data. You need companies that can not just give you that data, but companies that can tell you what it means and what to do next. And that's the really big part of it, because anything that's new, like you said, I mean, there's some of the emerging risks in conveyancing, things like wildfires and water scarcity and these things. Like, it's not so much is there data available, because the answer is yes. Like, there's lots of companies out there that are doing this. What the really key question is, and that's what practitioners are asking us and everyone, is, okay, but what do I do about it? Like, how does that materially impact this transaction? B, what do I really need to think about? C, can I manage it? And D, if not, should I walk away? Like that, and going through that process of diligence is really important, that you do that as early as you possibly can. And that is a real key, I think, to unlocking a big part of the kind of the planning system as it is right now.
I guess a big part of that is it's all about enabling it to scale to more consumers of that information, but also actionable in terms of what can be done with it. And I think probably one of the areas within planning that we're really starting to see this, and we've seen it's been introduced for a while, but it's that scalability question.
Yep.
Is biodiversity net gain. It's a really good example of a shift of a policy procedure being set out, a policy procedure also reacting to it, as we'll get into shortly, but it introduced structure, and then the key questions start to become around how to measure it, how to act on it, how to create those clear baselines. But frankly, it also raises a question around delivery and reactiveness and how it should look in practice. So what's been your perception of that from your experience?
Yeah, I find the B&G space, I mean, it's not core to my skill set, but I find it fascinating because that's an entity within sustainability that is slightly different in the sense that if I go back to the flood example, flood is something that, based on data telling you that there's a level of risk at a point in the future, you can then, for example, build your design in really simplistic fashion. You can put your house on stilts, right? So you can mitigate that risk into the future, and once that's done in the development space, it's kind of finished, like it's boxed off, and you know, if the data's right, you're not going to flood in 30, 40, 50 years time. B&G is slightly different in the sense that it's not a binary thing, so it's not something that if you factor a certain amount of considerations into your development plan that you've ticked that box and you've mitigated any consideration about the biodiversity value of that kind of area. You've also got to look 20, 30, 40 years into the future, but at the same time, you've got to then validate that what you said you were going to do and drive additional value into the environment is actually happening. Yeah. So it's a completely new structure, if you like, of doing things, and that's why I find it really interesting to see, because obviously there's guidance that's come out and there's legislation and everything else in terms of and the development industry is starting to tackle this now, and it's starting to become a consideration at the point of design and all the rest of it. But that future bit, like, we've not really, in my opinion, we've not really nailed that. Like, what does that look like? What's the reporting cycle? What's the governance? It's quite it's really interesting to see how it kind of all develops, but that's the wider game when it comes to climate change. Everything is in the future. Yeah. So you need to acknowledge that in how you tackle the now and how you frame your developments and everything else, whilst then having that eye on the future and making sure that you factored that into what you're doing today. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I really interesting from that perspective. I think, like you say, that statement of we have looked into the future, and a lot of data sets and a lot of suppliers and a lot of professionals around the market have built models and capabilities, flooding being a great example, that continue to look into the future based on scenarios, but they are run and they are assessed from a point in time. The planning application, the planning process, it is assessed now. What is that? The B&G legislation makes that statement of, well, what is your baseline and how do you continue that capability and continue to enhance it in that game, being the underlying statement across that. And you're right, that sort of slight similarity but fundamental difference in terms of its ongoing nature is going to be a really interesting aspect to adapt. And I think it probably lends itself into our next point, because suitability is of making planning decisions is key for that economic sustainability aspect. Whatever sort of investment we want to do up front in terms of assessment and analysis has got to have a payback period, otherwise it suddenly makes it an incredibly challenging position to have longevity in terms of its economic benefit. And I think one of the recent examples that we've started to see in terms of that suitability level or that scalability level of planning decision making is, again, the consistency with B&G and this statement around the smaller than 0.2 hectare development size and whether it has the same requirements for SMEs to report on that. So is there anything from your perspective, Chris, that you've seen in terms of that scalability or suitability of sustainable based decision making.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you talk about SMEs. I think that's a big. There's a big difference, I think, in practicality in terms of the world that we're getting to with this vast amount of data, trying to model that, trying to get really quick, actionable, upfront insight out of that then flows into really high level due diligence, sort of further down the chain. That world, I mean, put quite simply, is expensive. Like, if you're going to be successful in that world, you're going to need, for example, if you're talking about development viability, you're going to need really, really good foundational data that you can make very quick, very efficient decisions out the front end of, with some sort of high level upfront information that then flows into diligence down the road once you've either secured sites or once you're in the design phase and everything else. Like, there's a process to it. Big national house builders that's their bread and butter, that's what they do. But I think the test is going to be how well SMEs do with that process, because that's why there's such acute pressure, as we said, on that simplistic list of, say, 10 topics when it comes to sustainability. Like, okay, let's drop 2 off because we can only really cover off 3, 4, 5, 6 or 7 of them, or whatever the number is. That's why, because it's expensive, it's time consuming, and it takes effort.
Yeah.
So yeah, it won't be universal in terms of like how successfully the entire industry tackles like viability and everything else. It will come down to ultimately how mature the data foundation is, how mature the business is in terms of the way it interplays with data and the way it makes decisions, and ultimately, like, how's it funded?
Yeah. No, I think that statement in terms of how data is used, how it's funded, links quite well in terms of sort of some of the new policy perspective and expectations that we're starting to see. Because when I look at the planning industry, and look, it's an area of a lot of focus at the moment with both policy and many other aspects. And I think the way that I like to view it, just to keep it simple in my mind, if I'm completely honest, is there's 3 determining factors in terms of how quickly things are going to progress through the planning system. We have the policy statements. How do we structure our decision making? How do we structure the local and national scale decisions from a national plan through to spatial development strategies through to the local plan? And then the decision making goes behind it. Well, that's what we've seen as part of the MPPF updates and other sort of policy changes. The sort of second pillar as part of this is technology. It is all of the investment that we're seeing into the wonderful world of AI. Yes, it's mentioned already. There you go. It's a bingo card has now been hit. But there's the extract AI capabilities, as well as the automated decision pilots that we're seeing being rolled out. That is a significant investment, an interesting investment from government into its capabilities in its decision making, and then it's also the people. It's having an industry of skilled professionals who will act as, again, that sort of cliche statement, but human in the loop, act as the overriding strategists that sit behind local planning policy and the decision making when it comes to complex and detailed and robust, long-lasting placemaking. And I think you see those 3 aspects. You see the policy, the technology, and the people. And the planning policy is only really going to move as fast as the slowest one of those in terms of that. And I think it's probably interesting to see, like you were saying, with maybe the conveyancing market, but the sustainability adoption and sort of positioning following some of those 3 sort of pillars. So I guess, Chris, what does it look like from your perspective, where it's not just about policy? What's the people or the technology or the places that are also the other determining factors on the industry?
Yeah, I mean, you framed it really well. It's, there's technology and there's people, right? So on the side of technology, that's not just the systems or AI or whatever it is laid on top. It's the data foundation and the integrity of that and everything else. Like, there's that side of it, but then, from the people side, ultimately that's where guidance comes from, that's where regulation comes from, that's where decision making comes from, that's where approvals come from. Like those two sides is what dictates success. I think we've talked a lot about the challenges on the side of technology and data and where we need to get to in that space, and that's ongoing, and there's great progress being made there. Like we're in a much better place than we were even 6 months ago, and that will proliferate. Like that won't just get quicker in a straight line, that will get quicker in exponential fashion with AI and everything else. Then on obviously the side of kind of people, then ultimately that's going to be a determining factor. Like that, if you look at, to give you an example, like if you look at response times for sort of the bread and butter in one parts of our business in terms of contaminated land inquiries to local authorities, like you could get a response time anywhere ranging from instantaneous to 2 months. I mean, it's vast. So, and that won't ever really change. Like you're going to get a lot of variance in terms of systems, capacity, decision making, and all the rest of it. So it's never going to be a perfect world, but those two forces need to align and improve concurrently for us to make material progress.
Yeah, agreed. And I think it's also about the industry and the opportunities in sustainability being credible options for people at the start of their careers that are bringing through what is known to be a high level of interest in the world of sustainability, both from an environmental and other aspects, and giving them the options and capability to come into this industry, come into this market with a career development plan that can move them through there and keep, again, the long-lasting sort of focus on sustainability come through as part of that. Yeah. So, look, from that aspect today, we've talked through a huge number of different pieces, from the policy statements to the data sort of capabilities to the scalability and suitability of products and capabilities in the market. And I think, like we said right at the start, the question isn't whether planning and sustainability align. They are fundamentally joined at the hip as part of it, but it's about the alignment becoming more consistent from sort of the start of the process to the tail of the process. So if you were to look at sort of 3 priorities that you yourself or the industry are looking towards, what would be your top 3 choices for areas of focus for keeping it front of mind?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely call out decision confidence. Like, I think that's a really key thing. So it's not just how much data have we got to make a decision on. It's actually like, how easy is it to make a decision on that? How interoperable is it? Can we get a very quick view up front that gives us a really quick steer on viability? Those kind of things. Like decision confidence is huge. As well, I think in the kind of obviously we had the 2 boxes, the tech and the data side of it, and the people. On the people side of it, I'd probably suggest you need to balance a view from not just being based on policy compliance, but actually like outcome accountability. I think that's pretty important, and the whole BNG piece around conceptually, like we're not just making a decision for today, like is it going to be approved, yes or no, like it's how does that play out over time, not just at the point of approval. And then thirdly, I'd say we just need to recognise the need for kind of contextual flexibility, and the fact that if as we said right off the top, the environment itself is continually changing. How can any one site deliver the same outcomes in the same way? It's just not going to be the case. So we need some contextual flexibility within that ever-changing world of sustainability considerations. That's just the reality of it.
So yeah, it's less about sort of redesigning systems, but more about introducing and operating in how it operates in practice.
That's a much more succinct way of saying it than I did. Yeah. I think I'd go with that. But yeah,
so I forced you down that route with the choice of 3 that you had to bring into it as well. So yeah, I think just going to that previous point. So as we sort of wrap up and start to conclude, planning and sustainability aren't fundamentally in conflict, but the system is being asked to resolve a lot of priorities which can be traditionally considered competing, and it's all about finding that common ground that can be practically thought through, and I guess evidence with the example of BNG standing front of mind as we go through So the focus isn't necessarily on the better principles, but the availability of data technology, skilled professionals, and clear policy to help make better decisions under the real world conditions. So thanks everyone for joining us, and finally thank you very much, Chris, for your time and insights. Join us again for more property and land insights on Landmark Talks Property.
Thank you for listening to Landmark Talks Property. If you've enjoyed today's podcast, please hit subscribe. This podcast is for general purposes only. The views expressed are those of the hosts and guests and do not constitute professional advice.